for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a great honour to rise in this House and speak on the bill on counterfeiting measures. I've spoken many times over the last 10 years on these issues because what has happened in terms of legislative issues is the blurring often of the issues regarding copyright and counterfeit and trademark, and the need to come up with coherent policies that protect citizens, protects right holders. And this is not an easy situation because we're in a market that has transformed itself incredibly since Lord Macaulay in 1841 had talked about the need to protect the writers of the time. He said that we have to stop the, quote, knaves who take bread out of the mouths of deserving men. And Lord Macaulay believed that there needed to be copyright provisions. But Lord Macaulay also said there had to be a balance, that it wasn't about creating a monopoly for a certain group of book holders in London to stop other upstarts who were wanting to come in. And certainly we know the story of the reason Hollywood exists is because at that time California was beyond the copyright laws of the Thomas Edison Corporation, and they moved out to the desert not because it was beautiful, but because they were the original pirate culture, and they set themselves up and created an industry. So the issues of these balances throughout history it's a difficult act. What I'd like to talk about, we've seen with WIPO and the provisions of WIPO, we've seen with the ACTA, the Secretive Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, that had received such international backlash from ordinary citizens because it was blurring the roles between what should be considered domestic copyright policy and citizen right policy and the issue of counterfeit. And where this comes in is that we need to ensure that we can protect our rights holders and protect our citizens from the kind of counterfeit goods and bootleg operations that are undermining our economy, and we need to ensure that we have the tools to go against them. When we see large corporate rights holders say, well, let's spread that across the board, as my colleagues in the Liberal Party saying go after individuals for what their kid downloads a song and then sends it to 3 friends, we end up with an overreach. We've seen in the United States where they attempted through their Digital Copyright Millennium Act of the 1990s to create a legalistic response to the issues that the digital culture was creating, and certainly 35,000 lawsuits against citizens later, the market didn't come back. And what was missing from the market at that time was a coherent plan for the remuneration of artists who were facing some very difficult and challenging conditions because of the ease of copying. It used to be the only people who could actually copy had the means of production. You had the book binders, you had the record companies, but suddenly ordinary citizens could make copies. So the right to make copies became very challenged. Canada had come up with one of those solutions, which was the private copying levy. So we recognized in Canada that people were going to make all manner of copies, and it would be impossible to remunerate artists for all the copying that was going on, but that off every cassette that came off, a few pennies were put aside into a fund for artists. The decision by this Conservative government to kill the private copying levy has cost the Canadian music industry $25 million a year. Given the conditions of the music industry in Canada, that's $25 million we can't afford to lose. We see under the latest Copyright Act, the government killed the mechanical royalties for musicians and for the record industry, which is millions more. So at a time when the artistic culture of our country is very suffering, the need to remunerate those artists has been steadily whacked away at. The issue of collective copying regimes in schools, it certainly needs to be updated because of the digital culture, but to simply undermine it will leave artists working for free, and it will make the intellectual development and artistic development of our country much more challenged. The other issue we're seeing now is the Copyright Board's rules on streaming, live streaming. In the United States, it's an abysmal situation where Lady Gaga was paid $162 in royalties for over 1 million plays on, I think it was Spotify, on the streaming services. for someone of the magnitude of Lady Gaga to receive a $162 check shows you just how impossible it is for any other mid-sized artist to actually make a living and run a business doing the kind of music that Canada is. It is our premier export. We can talk about our oil and gas and our mining, but the talent that's come out of Canada in terms of music, our artists, our playwrights, internationally, this is an industry that we can't afford to undermine anymore. And yet, even though in the United States, the streaming royalties set by their copyright tariffs are so low that it's actually undermining the ability of any artist to survive, the Copyright Board in Canada has set it at 10% of the American rate. So they are living as paupers in the United States with what the Copyright Board has set for this new medium. And in Canada, it's only 10% of what the rate is in the United States. So we would assume then Lady Gaga, if she had 1 million plays in Canada, would get $16.50, which would make, again, anybody decide to go work at Tim Hortons rather than be an artist in this country. So those are the issues we're facing in terms of the need to protect our artists. How do we protect our artists? Well, we don't criminalize the consumer. We create a monetary stream. That's a reasonable solution. In terms of counterfeit, we have to separate, again, the issues about protecting our artists and giving our artists the tools that they need to be able to prosper while being able to go after the counterfeit gangs. I'll just stay on the artist situation for one more minute, Mr. Speaker, where we have small businesses, small creative artists. If their trademarks, if their arts are taken and by some counterfeit gang in China and reproduced, we have no mechanisms to go after those. Rights holders, when they're individual rights holders and when they're small rights holders, have no ability to go after these counterfeit operations. Sony can, Warner Brothers can, but the individual creative right holder who has their work stolen has no ability. And these are things that we should actually, if we're looking at international trade agreements, how do we provide provisions so that the small creative artists who are having their stuff stolen, that they can respond? Now, there's been some interesting elements in this bill. This bill is really an attempt to bring Canada in line with what came out of the ACTA negotiations. And we know with the ACTA negotiations, they were secretive. It was an overreach. It was a process that was to be set by lobbyists to be credible. And when it came to the public, there was a huge backlash. And it was interesting to see that that backlash was in Europe. So we see some of these provisions have been modified somewhat. It's very interesting now the border guards are able to seize goods, counterfeit goods at the border. That's a good provision, because before, rights holders actually had to go to court and get a court order, and it was very difficult. So giving the border guards the ability to seize goods at the border is a reasonable solution to deal with criminal counterfeit, because these counterfeit operations, they undermine our economy, but they also undermine basic health and security in this country. Again, I want to point out that our Liberal colleagues wanted to extend this to be able to go after individuals who are traveling, which would have made it the ultimate harassment tool for anybody traveling anywhere internationally, that you could be pulled out of a line and they'd say, hey, we want to look at your iPod. We're going to go through every single one of your songs. And we'll have the right to stop you if you sometimes my kids send me a song that they downloaded. I'm sure they downloaded off iTunes. I don't know. But I would be liable for that. That would be an overreach. So the Liberal position of going after individuals and criminalizing individuals, when the focus on our border guards should be going after the criminal gangs, is, I think, just very wrong-headed and actually out of step with pretty much the rest of the world, although maybe North Korea might side with them on that one. But our issue here is, if we're going to have counterfeit laws, we actually need the resources so the border guards can go after, and we see massive cuts in border services, and also our police, because our police don't often see that this is an issue, going after the knockoff goods, going after the bootleg DVDs. Whether or not we need to look at provisions that provide our police services the incentive to actually clean up some of these illegal trades in goods that have undermined our economy and also undermined safety for Canadians. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.